Good evening and welcome to the North Lexington Church of Christ for our Wednesday evening Bible study. It is a new quarter and we are beginning a new study this quarter. Steve finished up 1st and 2nd Samuel last week, and we are taking up the next two books of the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings. First, 2nd Kings are in the historical grouping of the Old Testament books. If you look at the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, originally these were all one book, or 1st and 2nd Kings were one book, 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book. They were, during the writing of the first Greek translation, they were separated into two books so that it would make it easier with the scrolls to be able to write one part of the book on a scroll rather than having to get something that was kind of unmanageable at that point in time. So we now have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. This again happened during the writing of the first Greek translation. These books, 1st Kings takes up where 2nd Samuel leaves off. It's interesting that these books really take up right at the almost seamlessly from the end of 2nd Samuel, but these books were written somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 years after 2nd Samuel was written or completely finished. So it's interesting that they were able to, the person that wrote 1st Kings and 2nd Kings were able to take up the narrative almost seamlessly in time with very little, what appears to be very little difference in the way it was approached. It is a historical record of Israel from the time of Solomon to the beginning and into the Babylonian captivity. These are not, these two books don't represent a biography of the kings. If this was simply a biography of each king, it would include things like the victories on the battlefield, the political victories that they had, the different alliances, things that were accomplishments of each one of these kings. But it is not. It is not the intent of these books to show just a biography of the kings. Rather, it evaluates the spiritual and the moral causes that led to the demise of both Israel and Judah. And it really details the mistakes that occurred along the way and the hearts of the people during this period of time. Both books stress the prophetic ministries of both Elijah and Elisha, beginning at the end of 1st Kings and into the first part of 2nd Kings. We'll be seeing both these prophets as it details their ministries very well. One thing we need to talk about in this, as we begin this study, is that neither the monarchy nor the temple were of God's intent. They were not God's intention. Both of these were man-made. Before the children of Israel occupied Canaan, God told them of these things that they were going to demand a king, and that was fulfilled. We see that the people asked for a king. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5, they went to Samuel and they told Samuel, "We want a king." And Samuel, because of that period of time, they had judges to judge over them that were appointed, called by God to judge over them. And the people went to Samuel and they said, well, you're getting old. Your sons are not people that we want. They're not able to judge us because they are not suitable for that role. And we want you to make us a king to judge over us so that we can be like all the nations. Now, God had told them before they ever left Canaan or left and occupy the land of Canaan, that they would one day demand a king in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 14. And for the same reason, so they could be like everybody else. We should really take pause when we decide that we want to do things so that we can be like everybody else. You can be in a very dangerous territory when you make decisions so that you can just be like everybody else. And this is a stern warning for us when we start thinking like that. Also, it was David's idea to build a temple. David, after he had built a house for himself, after the nations around them were at peace, that the nations around had been conquered, they had expanded the kingdom really into an empire. It was much larger. There was relative peace at this point in time. David, in his house that he had built, looked and he said, I've got this really nice house I'm living in, but God has that. We still have the tabernacle, and I think it would be a good idea to build God a temple rather than having that tent that he where we go to worship him now. So he asked Nathan to go inquire of God. God, do you think this is a good idea? I would really like to build you a house. God's response to Nathan for this was, he said, have I ever spoken a word to anyone from the tribes of Israel saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? God said, I never asked for this. Have I ever given David, any of the other people that I put in charge of this nation, have I ever at any time said, how come you haven't built me a temple or a house to worship me in? So this was not God's intention that they build this temple for him. It turned out to be a very splendid temple, but it was never God's intention. And we need to keep that in mind as we go throughout this study. This was David's idea. God granted the people a king, but he told them what the outcome of that was going to be, what the effect of having a king would be. And then he also allowed David allowed David's request, but he didn't let David build the temple. It was Solomon who ended up building the temple. So another thing about when the people asked for a king, in asking for a king, they had in effect rejected God as their king. And Samuel was very upset about this request. He went to God with it. God told Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And he said, go ahead and allow this, but tell them what's going to happen. And of course, Samuel does. They do end up, Samuel does go and he anoints Saul as king. And as we see throughout these next this quarter, we'll see that the things that Samuel said would happen did come true fruition and did exactly happen to these people. Now, combined, both of these books cover somewhere roughly 411 years or so. We're not exactly sure. There were times when, as in the reign of David in the last, we don't know how many years, the last part of David's reign, he also had Solomon reigning as well as co-regent for a period of time. That might have been a year, it might have been a few years, we don't know. So when it goes through, the chronology gets a little fuzzy as you're going through years, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 411 or so years was a time period of both First Kings and Second Kings. To put 400 years into perspective, 400 years ago, the Pilgrims were landing at Plymouth Rock. In 1620, they landed at Plymouth Rock, began the Plymouth colony, and here we are 400 years later, 2020. It seems like a very long time. Well, this was a very long time, but and we see all the many changes that has happened in America from 1620 to 2020. There's been an awful lot of changes, and as we go through and the people turn and do things, or they forget things, remember, this is a fairly long period of time. It doesn't take them long to forget often. But, I look at the changes that have happened just in my lifetime, and there are an awful lot of changes over the course of my lifetime. The things that we didn't do when I was young that are fully accepted now. So those kind of things, people's opinions, people's practices, those kind of happen very rapidly. And in the course of 400 years, a lot of changes can occur. And we need to be careful that we don't judge these people by saying, why did they do those things? Well, look at the changes that have occurred over our own lifetime. The book of First Kings covers about 120 years. Solomon reigned for 40 years, so about a third of that is Solomon's reign. The book of First Kings, the first 11 chapters are devoted to Solomon. And the reason for that is that at least from a human perspective, this was the best that Israel ever became. They were at their greatest extent as a nation. They were really an empire at this point because they had conquered other peoples, and those people were in subjection to them. So they really had a small empire. They were a regional power. They were at peace, which was also a good thing. 40 years of peace is a good thing. In our own nation's history, 40 years between wars is a pretty long time. We haven't really gone 40 years between wars very many times in our history. So anyway, the treasuries at that point in time were overflowing. And it was also a time when the temple was built. From a biblical standpoint or a spiritual standpoint, there were some pretty serious errors made during the reign of Solomon that kind of led to the state that Israel found themselves in as they went forward after Solomon's reign. So quite a bit of detail is devoted to Solomon and his reign, because that was sort of where they started the wheels kind of went off of the car, and they began to spiral down. They had spiral down into this trend that ultimately led to the captivities of the Assyrian captivity, and also to the Babylonian captivity. And so we see this over and over again. We see a bad things happening to them, but it's because of the things that started, small things, it seems, that started many years before that kind of led them down this path that they were ultimately led to captivity of God's people. Book of 2 Kings, really about almost 3 times as long, 2.5 times as long or so as 1 Kings. There's not a lot of focus like there was on Solomon. There are some high points in 2 Kings of some kings that did do good things, but it's really the steady progression that leads them into captivity. And they don't spend the writer didn't spend a lot of time on any one king in 2 Kings. It was a lot more history, but most of it was bad at that point. Some major divisions. 1 Kings, there was a united kingdom. That's when Judah and Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom as they became later, it was all Israel at that point. This lasted through the reign of Solomon, really lasted through the time of David. David is the one that became the king over both Israel and Judah, as Saul had been. But he expanded the kingdom, and also Solomon expanded the kingdom even more. It was all considered one kingdom at that point, until Solomon's son Rehoboam made a bad decision, and we see the divided kingdom in 931 BC, where you had the nation of Israel split into 2 separate entities. We see the northern kingdom of 10 tribes that became Israel, and then we see 2 tribes that became the southern kingdom of Judah. So we have Judah and Israel after that time period. In 2 Kings, we see Israel and Judah as 2 separate entities until 722 BC, when Israel is carried off into the Assyrian captivity. They never fully recovered from that. There might have been some that came back, but they really never returned from that Assyrian captivity. Afterwards, between 722 and 560, when Judah was taken into captivity, we see Judah is by itself, and the northern kingdom is completely gone. It's just Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin was such a small tribe that they were basically lumped in with Judah. So we see Judah and alone for this period of time before they also were taken into captivity. The time of this writing, it was completed somewhere after 561, which was this would have been during the Babylonian captivity. And the reason they think this is because they talk about the going into the Babylonian captivity and the release of a king from captivity but they don't talk about Cyrus giving the edict to allow the Israelite or the Jews to return to Palestine or to Judah at all in this. So we think it was before Cyrus wrote that edict allowing the children of Israel or the Jews that were the only ones left, the Jews to return to Jerusalem. So it would have mentioned that had that event occurred prior to this being completed, most likely. Again, it was written before Cyrus's edict in 539. We don't know who the author is of 1st and 2nd Kings. There are those who speculate that it was Jeremiah. In fact, Jewish tradition says that Jeremiah, they attribute this book to these two books to Jeremiah. Jeremiah did write the book of Jeremiah and Lamentations. They attribute this work also to him. There is a lot of disagreement over who actually wrote this. We don't know. So it could have been Jeremiah. He was certainly alive at that point in time and would have had access to the records that were used to write this material. But we don't know. We just don't know. The author doesn't identify himself in this book. The audience would have been the Jews that were either in Babylonian captivity when this book was finished, and those that were returning to Jerusalem after the captivity ended. So it would have been that period of time. And you'll notice in some of the writings, as he's writing some of the information in this, you'll see it talks about Israel and Judah, even when it was still the United Kingdom with Israel as a nation, it was still called, the author calls it Judah and Israel, even at that point in time, because the people that this was being written to would have understood that if he would have just said Israel, they would have immediately thought of Israel, the northern kingdom, not the entire nation. So he takes some pains to make sure that they understand during the reign of Solomon that it was Judah and Israel were under the reign of Solomon at that point in time. And it wasn't until later that they became two separate countries. Some important dates to remember in 1st and 2nd Kings. 931 was the year that the kingdom divided, and we see a split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. 722 is the beginning of the Assyrian captivity. We see that Samaria fell. The Assyrians took anyone who was of any use to them and took them into Samaria and back to Samaria into captivity. And anyone who was weak or they thought were not very of any real use, they left behind. So we see the 10 tribes of Israel basically disappearing for all practical purposes at that point, with just a few people left here and there. And then we don't really see them in the picture anymore until the 1st century, when the people that were left there and had intermarried with the Assyrians or the other people that were put in place there, we see the rise of the Samaritans and the people that the Jews hated in the 1st century. This was sort of the beginning of that group of people. And then we also see 586 BC, we see the fall of Jerusalem. and the Babylonian captivity. Actually, the Babylonians came 3 separate times and took people into captivity. 586 was when Jerusalem was conquered, or it was defeated completely. It was destroyed. The temple was burned to the ground and destroyed. The parts that were wood or cedar, it was completely gutted. The walls were pulled down. It was destroyed, and the people were taken into captivity. There were just a few people left. Many went into that were left went into Egypt for a period of time, but there were still a few people that were left in afterwards. Talk a little bit about the political climate at the end of David's reign. Now, David had greatly expanded the borders of Israel during his reign. When he took over, Israel was a fairly small country. During his reign, he greatly expanded the borders of Israel, and we see that Israel went from being a small nation to an empire. An empire meaning it was the country, and then it had other countries that were subservient to them, that paid tribute to them every year. And we see during the reign of Solomon, there were several countries that had been neighbors of Israel that now fell under the sphere of influence of Israel and had to pay tribute to them every year and pay that money into their treasuries. So it was much larger kingdom, a much larger area during that particular time. Israel had really become a regional power in that time. Israel's neighbors, again, had been either completely subdued and were paying tribute, or they were on friendly terms with Israel at that time. And there was also relative peace. That didn't come until really close to the end of David's reign. But the nation had finally gotten to the point that it was pretty calm, which allowed, when Solomon became king, allowed him to do a lot of things that he might not have been able to do had he been fighting to preserve his borders and other things, or had to conduct military operations against different nations around him continuously, as David had done. So with the nation at peace, there were a lot of things he could do, like building projects and other things that he was allowed to do because they were at peace. Israel was really in a very good position. If you look at the nation, the whole area of Palestine, if you look at the yellow areas, when David took over as king, this yellow area was the nation of Israel, and Judah down here. Now, when David gave the kingdom to Solomon at his death, you see this green area. Well, the yellow and the purple areas were what David got or started with. When he finished his reign as king, this green area was also what David had added to the kingdom, that when Solomon took over, this was where the extent of the kingdom was. During the reign of Solomon, Solomon also added this area up here to the north. And you see in this area, one thing you might want to notice up here is the Euphrates River. And so this is the largest, the greatest extent that the nation ever got to in its entire time. A little bit about the kingdom. Again, the United Kingdom of Israel had three kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. The divided kingdom was Israel and Judah. Again, Israel being the 10 tribes in the north, and Judah and Benjamin making up the other 2 tribes in the southern part of the kingdom were known as Judah, because Benjamin was such a small part of that. Again, 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. Talk a little bit about the spiritual condition of these kings during this period of time. The nation of Israel, when it split off from the nation and became the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, they had a total of 19 kings. Every single king that they had was evil. There were none that were considered as good rulers from a spiritual standpoint. None of these kings helped the people come back to a better relationship with God. So they were all considered evil kings. If you look at the nation of Judah, again, during this divided kingdom part, Judah had a total of 19 kings as well. 8 of these kings were considered good, that brought reform of some kind. Some brought more reform than others. Some did a very good job of bringing the people back closer to God. But many times they were followed by their son or their grandson that took the people right back into idolatry. So it was whatever reforms happened were very short-lived. Mr. Kaufman says that the big lesson that we can learn from this period of time, he really says that these two books are not really worth spending a lot of time on. He says that the big lesson from the account of the kings of Judah and Israel is simply the preservation of the posterity of the patriarchs as an identifiable element of the world's population. In other words, we see God preserving the people that he had told, his own special people, where he had made a covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and said, I've got these people, they're going to be my people. And we see this preservation occur when they were wandering in the desert. We see this preservation happening during the period of the judges. We see this happening during the time of Saul and David. We see it continue during the time of the kings that followed them, and even into captivity. We see God watching over and preserving his people until the time of Jesus that came and became the Savior of the world. We see this God preserving his people until this promised Messiah could enter the world and die for the world's sins, to be the sacrifice for us. So this is I hope this is going to be an interesting study for you. It is for me. I really like looking at the mistakes that many of these kings have made during their reigns, and try to understand why these kind of things happened the way they did. So looking forward to this study, and hope you will continue to be a part of it. And Lord willing, next week we will be having a live presentation from the building rather than a recording. So until then, I hope you stay safe and stay well.